Imagine you're standing, in a sinking boat. Like water is just pouring through this massive hole in the hull.
Right. Total disaster scenario.
Exactly. And instead of handing you wood and nails and a hammer, your company's HR department walks up and hands you a teacup.
A teacup.
Yeah, a teacup and like a glossy pamphlet on how to bail water more mindfully.
That is, it's incredibly bleak, but it's such an accurate analogy.
It is exactly how modern corporations treat workplace burnout, right? We're constantly told to try yoga or download a meditation app or manage our time better, all while the actual structural realities of our jobs are just completely ignored.
Yeah, it's the ultimate downstream solution to a totally upstream problem, which is exactly what we're looking at today.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive, we are getting into a massive, and I mean massive, research synthesis by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover.
Yeah, he aggregated 52 systematic reviews. And if you break that down, it covers nearly 1,000 primary intervention studies.
1,000 studies.
Exactly. And the whole goal here is to figure out what actually works to build a healthy, sustainable workplace. Like separating the truly evidence-based organizational changes from all that, feel-good corporate fluff.
Because the stakes here, they're so much higher than just making people feel a little bit more cheerful on a Monday morning.
Wow, absolutely.
The data Westover synthesized shows that our work environments literally dictate our physical health. One statistic that just stopped me in my tracks was about job strain.
The coronary heart disease link?
Yes, that the psychosocial stressors of a toxic work environment are an actual measured predictor of coronary heart disease. And the effect sizes are comparable to universally recognized risk factors, like smoking.
Which is just a staggering comparison to make, right? But to understand how that happens, you have to look at the biological mechanism at play here.
Like what's actually happening in the body.
Right. When you're in a highly stressful work environment, your body enters this perpetual state of fight or flight. And this creates something researchers call allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Yeah, essentially your system is constantly flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And over time, that doesn't just make you feel anxious, it creates systemic inflammation throughout your entire body.
So it's not just in your head.
Exactly. The actual arteries supplying your heart become inflamed, which makes them way more susceptible to plaque buildup. So a bad boss or, an impossible workload, it's actively physically damaging your cardiovascular system.
Wow.
We're talking about public health and longevity here, not just like job satisfaction scores.
So if the human cost is quite literally measured in cardiovascular damage, the natural question for me is, well, what is this doing to the organization itself?
It's destroying them.
Right, because these toxic environments aren't just hurting people, they are quietly bankrupting companies. And the research breaks down the anatomy of a broken work environment into some incredibly stark metrics, starting with presenteeism.
Presenteeism is such a fascinating and destructive phenomenon.
Define that for us, just so we're clear.
Sure, it's when employees physically show up to work, but they are unwell, like either physically sick or completely mentally drained.
They're in the chair, but nobody's home.
Exactly. And the research indicates that the financial drain of presenteeism often exceeds the cost of an employee actually taking a sick day.
Wait, really? It costs more for them to be there?
Yes, because when someone is working through severe burnout or illness, their cognitive capacity just plummets. They suffer from reduced problem-solving abilities, their processing speed drops, and they start making compounding errors.
Right, so they're physically at the desk, their brain is running on fumes, which means someone else is going to have to spend hours fixing their mistakes the next day.
Precisely. And the next level of financial hemorrhage is the direct cost of turnover.
Which is huge.
Westover's synthesis really highlights the healthcare sector to illustrate this. The data shows that replacing a single departing nurse costs a hospital system between $40,000 and $60,000.
$60,000 for one single nurse.
For one nurse? Because that covers recruitment, onboarding, lost productivity during that whole training period, the administrative overhead. It adds up incredibly fast.
And that 50 or 60 grand hit is really just the beginning, right? Because turnover creates this awful cascading effect.
Oh, the death spiral.
Yeah. When one nurse leaves, their patients don't just magically disappear. That workload gets dumped straight onto the remaining staff, who are already stretched way too thin.
Right, so now their stress levels spike.
For allostatic load increases, and boom, they become prime candidates for burnout and resignation themselves. It's a complete organizational death spiral.
It is. And the theoretical framework that best explains why this death spiral happens is Karasek's demand control support theory.
Okay, break that down for us.
So if you map out different types of jobs, the absolute most dangerous configuration for human health is the combination of high job demands and low job control.
High demands, low control.
Yes. This creates what researchers call a high-strain environment. Imagine you are buried under a mountain of urgent work, but you have absolutely no autonomy over how, when, or where you execute that work.
You can't prioritize anything.
Exactly. You can't delegate. Your methods are completely micromanaged. That specific combination is a direct pipeline to severe depression and just, squandered human capital.
I want you, the listener, to actually reflect on your own job for a second. Think about your personal ratio of demands to control. Are you carrying a massive load, but you're trusted to steer the ship? Or are you carrying that massive load while someone else dictates your every single move?
Because the psychological weight of those two scenarios is entirely different.
Completely different. But this brings up a massive contradiction for me. If the costs are this incredibly high tens of thousands of dollars per employee, lost productivity, huge error rates, why do companies tolerate the bleeding? Like, do they just not know what to change?
It generally comes down to visibility and, well, the path of least resistance. Organizations tend to focus on the downstream, individual consequences, like one person's absenteeism or a very specific error on a spreadsheet.
Because it's easy to see.
Exactly. Those things are highly visible and super easy to measure. Analyzing the complex upstream causes requires an organization to actually look in the mirror.
And nobody wants to do that.
Management has to admit that the workflow they meticulously designed or the staffing ratios they approved to save a quick buck are fundamentally flawed.
Buying a bulk subscription to a wellness app is just a simple, one-time line item on a budget.
Right. While redesigning an entire organizational structure requires really painful self-reflection and sustained effort.
But if that toxic combination is high demands and low control, the data has to point toward giving people their autonomy back, right?
It absolutely does.
And reading through Westover's review, the interventions that actually have strong, proven evidence behind them, they're surprisingly practical.
Very practical. It's not about overhauling human nature at all.
No, it's about redesigning how we interact with our tasks. And a huge portion of this centers on working time arrangements.
That is the first major category of successful intervention. And the evidence here is rated as strong. What's crucial to note, though, is that this isn't necessarily about working fewer total hours.
Right.
It's about predictability and giving the worker a voice in their own schedule. Self-scheduling systems where employees actively participate in creating their rosters drastically reduce job strain.
And there's also that highly effective intervention regarding shift work, minimizing what the research calls quick returns.
Yes, the quick returns metric is vital.
Just to clarify, a quick return is when you finish a late shift and then have to be right back at work early the next morning.
Right. Specifically, having less than 11 hours between the end of one shift and the start of the next. When organizations completely eliminate quick returns, they see an immediate drop in exhaustion metrics.
Because they can actually sleep.
Exactly. The biological reason is so simple. A quick return completely destroys sleep architecture. By the time an employee commutes home, winds down, actually falls asleep, wakes up, and commutes back, they are getting a fraction of the deep, restorative sleep their brain needs.
To clear out the stress hormones from the previous day.
Exactly. Fixing the schedule fixes the recovery period.
And giving people control over their time applies just as much to white-collar jobs as it does to shift work, too. The Boeing case study in the data perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, the Boeing study is a classic.
Yeah. Boeing's engineering division rolled out this initiative to allow flexible start times. They established a window of core collaboration hours, say everyone has to be available between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. But outside of that, the engineers could build their own schedules.
Right.
But what fascinated me wasn't the schedule itself. It was the friction of actually implementing it.
The managerial friction is always the biggest hurdle. To make flexible schedules work, Boeing had to completely retrain their supervisors to shift their mindset away from physical presence.
Right, because for decades, a manager's instinct was to evaluate an employee based on whether they were sitting at their desk at exactly 8 a.m.
Yeah, Boeing had to force managers to track actual outcomes and deliverables instead, which is a massive cultural shift away from presenteeism.
But the data shows it worked. They maintained their productivity, retention improved, and work-life balance scores went up.
It was a huge success.
But, flexible hours only solve the when of work. If I'm working the hours I chose, but my boss is still micromanaging my every decision, I'm still trapped in Karasek's low control quadrant.
That's true.
So how does the data suggest organizations fix the how?
This brings us to the interventions focused on giving workers influence over their actual tasks, and the evidence here is rated moderate to strong. It relies on a really simple premise. If market forces or client needs dictate that you cannot reduce the intense demands of a job, you absolutely must increase the employee's control over how they meet those demands.
Which brings us to that manufacturing sector case study in the research. It completely dismantles the traditional way we think about factories.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Normally, an assembly line is like the ultimate low-control environment, right? Everyone is highly specialized, executing one repetitive motion over and over, while some foreman just barks orders at them.
The classic Taylorism model.
Right. But this company threw that entire model out. They transitioned their workers into self-directed teams of 8 to 12 people and gave those teams total ownership of the production process.
And total ownership meant the workers themselves allocated the tasks each day.
Wow.
They performed their own quality control, they managed the scheduling, and they even ordered their own materials. Supervisory roles were completely stripped of direct control and converted into purely supportive, facilitative positions.
That structural shift is immense.
It was. But the physiological and psychological outcomes were just undeniable.
I mean, musculoskeletal complaints plummeted.
Yes. Because instead of performing the exact same repetitive motion for 8 hours straight, workers were naturally rotating tasks throughout the day, which distributes the physical strain across different muscle groups.
That makes so much sense.
And furthermore, job satisfaction improved and the actual quality of the manufactured products increased because the people building the product were the ones governing the quality checks.
Now, I do have to point out the elephant in the room with that manufacturing example, though.
The productivity dip.
The productivity dip. The data clearly shows that when they first made this radical switch, productivity initially took a huge nosedive. And honestly, that makes perfect sense to me.
How so?
I think of it like trying to learn a new, more efficient keyboard layout, like switching from a standard QWERTY keyboard to a Dvorak keyboard.
Okay.
The ultimate goal is to type faster. But for that first month,
Yeah.
your brain is rewiring itself. You drop from 80 words a minute to 15 words a minute, and it is absolute agony.
Right.
Every instinct you have is screaming at you to just plug the old keyboard back in.
No.
So how do these organizations survive that initial valley of despair without management just panicking and reverting to the old toxic workflows?
That right there is the critical vulnerability of any major organizational change. And the research provides a very clear answer. It all comes down to the underlying motivation for the intervention.
The motivation.
Yes. The data reveals that interventions driven by a genuine, stated desire to improve worker well-being succeed at a much higher rate than those driven purely by a desire to reduce operational costs.
Oh, because if the only goal is the bottom line, management gets spooked the second that line goes down.
Precisely. If it's just a cost-saving measure, the minute productivity dips during that learning curve, leadership panics and pulls the plug.
They plug the old keyboard back in.
Exactly. But if the core motivation is long-term sustainability and employee health, the leadership team anticipates that friction. They understand that a temporary dip is just the cost of building a resilient system.
Right.
They ride out the learning curve, and just as the manufacturing study showed, the productivity eventually rebounded and actually exceeded previous levels.
So motivation dictates endurance. Now, it seems like the logical next step for any company listening to this would be to simply train their managers to grant this level of autonomy.
You think so?
Right. Just put the middle managers in a 3-day seminar on empowering employees. But reading through the findings, the interventions that target leadership behavior directly are shockingly inconclusive.
This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in Dr. Westover's whole synthesis. You would assume leadership training is a super easy win.
Right.
But the data shows highly contradictory results. The reviews found that while these training programs reliably make the leaders themselves feel more knowledgeable and confident in their skills,
there is virtually no consistent evidence that this training actually improves the well-being of the employees reporting to them.
Exactly. It's a disconnect.
It reminds me of the childhood game of telephone, where a message gets whispered down a line of people and is just completely distorted by the end.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right, because for a leadership seminar to actually reduce my burnout as an employee, the chain of events has to be basically flawless. First, the training has to genuinely increase the manager's knowledge. Second, that knowledge has to translate into real, observable behavior change.
Which is hard enough.
Exactly. Third, that new behavior has to be sustained over months, not just for the week following the seminar. And fourth, that sustained behavior has to actually impact my daily workflow in a meaningful way.
Yes.
If that chain breaks at any single link, the multi-million-dollar training program is completely invisible to me on the ground.
That is an incredibly accurate way to model it. And the chain usually breaks because of the broader organizational culture. You can train a manager to be empathetic and to grant autonomy. But if that manager's own performance bonus is tied to ruthless short-term production quotas, their training will evaporate the second they feel pressure from above. Culture eats training for breakfast.
Always.
But leadership isn't the only area where these quote-unquote common sense interventions fail. The research highlights a really fascinating failure regarding workplace violence prevention in a hospital emergency department.
Yes. The emergency room case study actually terrified me because it proves that you can do everything seemingly right on paper and still make a situation worse.
It's wild.
The hospital implemented a comprehensive safety intervention. They trained the nursing staff on de-escalation techniques, they upgraded the lighting in the waiting rooms, they installed mirrors so staff could see around blind corners.
And instituted strict zero-tolerance policies for patient aggression.
Exactly. And the result, the official reports of verbal abuse and threats directed at the staff actually increased.
On a spreadsheet, that looks like a catastrophic failure. The intervention designed to stop violence was correlated with more violence.
Right. But if we look at the psychological mechanics at play, I suspect the mirrors and the policies didn't suddenly enrage the patients.
No, probably not.
The intervention likely made the nursing staff finally feel supported enough by management to report the baseline level of abuse they had been enduring all along.
Exactly.
Before the zero-tolerance policy, they were probably just suffering in silence because they assumed management wouldn't do anything about it. So the hostile behavior itself might not have increased at all. Just the safety to report it did.
That is a very robust hypothesis, and it really highlights the danger of relying solely on incident reports to measure success.
Definitely.
But the other critical insight from that ER case study is the danger of ignoring root causes. You can train an emergency room nurse to master verbal de-escalation, and you can put up all the mirrors in the world. But if a patient is sitting in a waiting room for 8 hours, in agonizing pain, because the hospital refuses to hire enough doctors to clear the backlog, violence is inevitable.
Because the system is broken.
Exactly. The intervention failed to stop the aggression because it merely addressed the symptoms of the conflict. The root cause was a systemic resource bottleneck. You just cannot de-escalate a broken system.
Man, so if leadership training gets swallowed by a toxic culture and safety protocols miss the root causes of the friction, how does an organization actually create permanent change? It seems like you have to rewire the corporate DNA.
You do. The organizations that successfully lower burnout embed psychosocial risk management permanently into their structural governance.
So it's not just an HR thing.
No, it cannot be an isolated HR initiative. It must be a core business function. The synthesis details a Scandinavian manufacturing company that executed this flawlessly.
Okay, what did they do?
They decided that employee health metrics would be treated with the exact same weight as financial metrics. They tied their managers' annual performance evaluations and their bonuses directly to the work environment scores of their teams.
Wow. I can only imagine the friction that caused in the boardroom.
Oh, I'm sure it was intense.
Just imagine projecting a slide showing quarterly revenue, and right next to it, a slide showing the psychosocial health of the production floor and telling the board of directors that both matter equally.
It was a radical shift in priorities, but it signaled to the entire workforce that psychological health was no longer a peripheral concern. To really grasp why structural changes like this are necessary, we need to examine the psychological contract.
The psychological contract, I imagine a lot of this boils down to the unwritten rules of a job.
Yeah.
Like, we all have a psychological contract with our employer, even if we never signed a piece of paper.
Exactly. The psychological contract is the implicit agreement regarding mutual obligations. When you accept a job, you agree to provide your time, your intellectual energy, and your skills. In return, you implicitly expect fair compensation, reasonable demands, basic respect, and a safe environment.
That seems fair.
Right. But when a company steadily increases your workload without increasing your resources, or when demands become physically impossible to meet, they are violating that unwritten contract.
Yeah.
The moment an employee realizes that contract is fractured, Their internal motivation collapses and burnout spikes immediately.
I want to turn this directly to you, the listener, again. Think about the interview process for your current role. Compare the narrative you were sold in that interview to the reality of your day-to-day workflow.
The realistic job preview.
Yeah, did the hiring manager give you a realistic preview of the grueling weeks, the resource shortages, the difficult clients, or were you sold a pristine fantasy? Because the gap between the fantasy you were sold and the reality you were navigating, that is the exact size of the fracture in your psychological contract.
And repairing a fractured contract requires formal, unavoidable structures. The data heavily supports the implementation of mandatory workload management conversations.
Not just casual chats.
No, these cannot be casual hallway check-ins where a manager just asks, "Hey, how's it going?" They must be structured, documented, and explicitly non-punitive. The research outlines a hospital system that achieved this by instituting a formal escalation protocol.
Oh, this was the system where if the staff-to-patient ratio crossed into dangerous territory, a specific set of actions was automatically triggered.
Correct. And the brilliance of that protocol is that it entirely removed the burden of failure from the individual nurse.
Also,
Instead of a nurse feeling inadequate because they physically couldn't monitor 10 critical patients simultaneously, the protocol classified the situation as a systemic failure.
oh, that's powerful.
It forced senior management to immediately review the staffing levels and officially document their response. It shifted the accountability away from the individual worker's coping skills and placed it firmly on the organization's resource allocation.
It's the difference between handing the sailor a teacup and forcing the captain to acknowledge the hole in the hull.
Exactly.
So, looking at the totality of these 1,000 studies, a very clear picture emerges. Combating toxic work environments is not about individual resilience.
Not at all.
It is not about teaching employees to just breathe through the stress of chronic understaffing. It requires upstream systemic shifts. It requires giving workers tangible autonomy over their time and tasks, prioritizing long-term health over short-term productivity dips, and treating the psychological well-being of the workforce with the exact same urgency as quarterly profit margins.
Yeah, and Dr. Westover's synthesis leaves us with one crucial distinction to remember here: the difference between immediate relief and long-term cures.
Proximal versus distal effects.
Right, exactly. We cannot guarantee that a new scheduling policy will instantly cure a decade of chronic health issues, or that turning an assembly line into a self-directed team will drop the turnover rate to zero overnight. The variables are simply too complex.
Right. There's no magic wand.
But the evidence proves beyond a doubt that we can provide immediate relief. We can successfully change the conditions of the daily grind. We might not be able to guarantee a perfect utopia, but an organization absolutely has the power to make their employees' Tuesday significantly less miserable.
Yeah. Make Tuesday less miserable. That is an incredibly grounded goal. We're going to leave you with a final thought to reflect on today. We just spent a lot of time discussing the unwritten psychological contract between you and your employer.
Yeah.
But I want you to ask yourself, have you ever actually articulated your side of that contract out loud? If you sat down tonight and wrote out exactly what you implicitly expect from your organization in exchange for your mental energy, your time, and your health, would you be shocked by how much they are currently defaulting on that debt?
That's a tough question.
Take a hard look at your own psychological contract today. Look at the terms you are currently accepting and ask yourself if it is time to renegotiate them. Or, at the very least, ask yourself if it's time to put down the teacup and demand they fix the boat.